Great, thank you. We're just at 101 here on the East Coast. I'm in New York City. Thank you so much for joining. Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Center for Disaster Philanthropy Crisis Response webinar, U.S. Severe Weather, How Funders Can Support Recovery. My name is Sharad Agarwal, and my pronouns are he, him. I am CDP's Vice President of Fund Management and Coalition Building, and I oversee our grant-making team. I bring more than 25 years of experience in partnership and resource development, grant and financial management, and program operations to my work. Before joining CDP, I was at BRAC USA, guiding and strengthening BRAC's positioning in North America. Prior to BRAC, I spent more than 15 years with the United Methodist Committee on Relief, UMCOR, during which I oversaw their country programs around the world. Some housekeeping rules. Notes before we get started. You can submit questions at any time during the webinar using the Q&A box at the bottom of your screen, and we will answer them at the end of the panel presentations. At the end of the webinar, there will be a short survey. Please complete this to help us improve our webinar offerings to meet your needs better. And finally, we are recording this webinar. It will be available on our website and YouTube channel shortly after the webinar is complete. Live captioning is available now via Zoom. Click on Closed Caption Live Transcript to access it. You can also access it in languages other than English. This webinar is co-sponsored by Council on Foundations, Giving Compass, and United Philanthropy Forum. They are great partners, and we appreciate their support for this webinar. As we begin this webinar, CDP acknowledges it works on the stolen lands of many original peoples. We recognize that indigenous peoples have been displaced and disenfranchised from their land by the socioeconomic and cultural impacts of colonialism and disasters. The erasure of indigenous knowledge about how to care for these lands has caused environmental destruction and degradation. CDP is committed to dismantling the ongoing legacies, systems, and structures of settler colonialism and white supremacy, and their connections to philanthropy, today and in the future. Despite centuries of theft, violence, and murder, this is still, and always will be, Indigenous land. Please join us in acknowledging the original peoples and their elders, and past, present, and future generations. At the end of the webinar, donors will understand the connection of climate change to this year's severe weather, learn how to plan your emergency giving strategy before a disaster hits, understand how to address root causes that make marginalized populations more at risk from the impacts of severe weather so they can recover quicker and more equitably from disasters. So shall we take a look at the poll results? So pretty incredible statistics there. More than 3/4 of the poll participants have known someone to be affected by severe weather in the US this year. And pretty fairly evenly divided between strongly agree and neither disagree around seeing signs of donor fatigue, but more than half are seeing signs of donor fatigue. So hopefully we'll be able to touch on that subject a little bit later during our conversation. Before introducing our speakers today, I wanted to provide some context and background to the topic. At the end of May, the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, or NOAA, had tracked 11 disasters that have an economic cost of more than $1 billion each. Combined, they have damages or costs of $25.1 billion. In 2023, there were $28 billion disasters. 2024's billion-dollar events include 4 tornado outbreaks, 3 winter storms, several spring storms, and the derecho and flooding in Texas. None of these events have a name. Many have impacted multiple areas of the country and brought combined hazards including heavy rain, strong winds, hail, and floods. But they are just the tip of the iceberg, so to speak. There have been about 1,000 tornadoes this year. We have seen a derecho hit Houston, and floods hit numerous places across the country. Yuma, Colorado had hail so big that heavy equipment was needed to move it off the streets. In the past few weeks, we've seen massive flooding in the Midwest, extreme heat across much of the world, and 5 near simultaneous disasters in New Mexico. And the US is not alone. Around the world, hundreds of disasters have occurred this year, from small tornadoes and extensive floods to cyclones to extreme heat. Now it is my honor to introduce our special guests. I'm very much looking forward to the information they will share with us. Dr. Barb Mays-Bausted is NOAA's Climate Ready Nation Coordinator. Prior to this role, Dr. Bausted had several positions with NOAA's National Weather Service and local, regional, and national roles spanning both weather and climate. She was a contributing author to the 4th and 5th National Climate Assessments focusing on the Midwest and Northern Great Plains. As Program Director for Vibrant's Crisis Emotional Care Team, Amy Carol Dominguez provides strategic oversight for responses, engagements, and advocacy in and around disaster behavioral health. She has been working in the space since 2007 and has recently been involved as a team leader responding to current refugee crises in private-public partnerships, a just-in-time training response to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, providing support for staff managing unaccompanied minors at the US border, and introducing narrative coping programming to schools receiving asylum seeker students. Thomasina Burns is the co-executive director of Houston Responds. Thomasina brings a wealth of nonprofit experience and a deep-rooted commitment to Houston Responds mission. She joined the organization soon after its founding and has directed programs and operations for the organization. She has nearly 20 years of nonprofit and church ministry experience. I'm proud to say that Houston Responds and Vibrant Emotional Health are CDP grantees. Carrie McCann Botel has been president of the Iowa Council of Foundations since 2015. She oversees organizational activities including education and outreach for the purpose of strengthening, guiding, and growing philanthropy in Iowa. An Iowa native, Carrie brings her lived rural experience, passion for place-based leadership, and collaborative spirit to the network each day. Prior to joining the Iowa Council of Foundations, Carrie was the director of nonprofit partnerships and grant making at the Community Foundation of Greater Dubuque. Barb, Amy, Thomasina, and Carrie, I'm pleased to speak with you all, and I appreciate you taking the time to share your expertise with us today. Amy, let's start with you. How do continual disasters affect individuals differently compared to one-off disasters?
So I think it's important to note that when we're talking about the realities that all of us are facing right now in the communities where we work, it is rare that there is an individual or a community that is only dealing with one issue. And as we at Vibrant, we're considering the impact of disasters, specifically through the lens of the pandemic. We wanted to do a little bit of work to talk about the community stress load threshold that we all endure and build a framework which we call the model for adaptive response in complex cyclical disasters, or the mark D. And we'll share that link, I believe, later on. And this framework has different sections that speak to the anticipated and expected experience through the lens of mental and emotional well-being. So it's important to note that although these incidences in and of themselves have what we would call a acute phase and the immediate impact, recovery, and resilience, these incidents occur layering on top of each other. And we do have to consider when we're thinking about responses and thinking about both immediate and long-term care, the foundational issues of that community, the chronic stressors that exist, and then the acute stressors that are being brought on by that incident of itself. You can go to the next slide. And we created this particular image within that framework where we talk about the community balance sheet, understanding that within every disaster and incident, there's that anticipation, impact, adaptation, and recovery phase that we're all familiar with if we've been in disaster response for long. But we have to see it as layering and understanding that just because we are now facing a new incident, it doesn't mean that the community is out of the woods from the previous one. And so we think of communities like Nashville and different communities in Colorado and communities in California, where they're not just dealing with fires or flooding or tornadoes, but they're dealing with racial tension, political tension, deep realities that impact some individual and community well-being. So it's knowing that allows us to take this posture of being human first and acknowledging when we're looking at our systems and looking at our strategies, how are we caring for these individuals and our community as a whole, understanding everything that we have walked through. So
Thank you, Amy. Really appreciate you sharing that framework together with us. And just recognizing the holistic nature of the individual and the community and history and experience and how that factors into how we respond in times of disaster and recovery. Thank you, Amy. Carrie, Iowa was hit by massive flooding late last week, but that's just one of many disasters that you had this year. What is the impact you're seeing of disaster after disaster, especially on marginalized communities and organizations providing assistance?
Well, I would say what Amy just shared brought a very clear visual to what we've been experiencing here in our state. We have a monthly newsletter that goes out to our membership. In the last 3 months, I've had to write about recent events that have occurred in our state, primarily in Western Iowa, but almost every corner of the state has experienced something. Tornadoes in April and May in Southwest Iowa and along the western edge of Iowa, and now significant flooding in Northwest Iowa. What we have seen is fatigue. The question at the top of the webinar with the poll around donor fatigue is definitely something we've experienced. I think some of the traditional giving sources, maybe national funders who support disaster response and recovery, and local funders who have resources to allocate, that has still been very active. But we like to think of ourselves as Iowans helping Iowans, and people truly don't have the capacity to continue giving and giving and giving with all of these disasters. So the local philanthropy is something that I'm particularly concerned about. We've also seen that fatigue with funders themselves. We have at least one community foundation in each of our 99 counties in Iowa. And we have worked for the past decade in partnership with CDP and the Funders Network to think about how community foundations play a role in that disaster, both preparedness, response, and recovery. And they're getting fatigued from activating and opening those funds and then distributing those resources. That takes a lot of their capacity and resources as well. And in our state individual assistance is allocated through our community action agencies, and many of those serve more than one county. So when you have these repeating disasters that are affecting the same counties or the same geographic areas, a lot of those organizations just haven't had the infrastructure and human capital to keep the resources flowing as quickly as we would like to see them to supporting communities. Of course, that impacts marginalized communities in more significant ways. And I think we have seen some silver linings of folks learning from past mistakes, and we're getting a little bit smarter. But when you're in the thick of it, it's really hard to pass those lessons on to community. So we've tried to serve as that network hub, capture some of those resources and learnings in our community foundation's disaster philanthropy toolkit, and keep those out in front of folks who are in the midst of disaster, but really needing to be frontline and helping their communities.
Thank you. That was an incredible, just great summary of the stressors and also just how what opportunities there are for us as a community to be more responsive to this continuing trend of disasters on the same communities over and over again. Thank you. Thomasina, let me bring you in now. Texas has also had a lot of disasters this year, including tornadoes, floods, and a derecho. What are the populations you're seeing get hit multiple times?
Well, yes, thank you. In those, it's been a lot of the rural communities, those small county and those rural areas outside of the great metropolitan part of Houston, and then also inside of Houston, the communities that are, even though they're inner city, but they are mostly with elderly or those that are fit in below, at or below the level of poverty in those areas, and then some of them are full of immigrants. And then the way Houston is structured, we have some unincorporated parts of our county that's not necessarily in the city limits, but in the county, and they're usually are hit hard. Those are usually the overlooked and under-resourced areas that have get hit multiple times, and it's usually from infrastructure, um, whether if it's in the rural part or just the infrastructure of being where they sit in that part of the county. A lot of it's the industrial part of the town of the city, so it's a communities of homes there, but it's not a lot of large corporations and a lot of traffic.
Sherrod, you're muted.
Sorry. um, Barb, let's build a bit on Carrie and Thomasina's comments. Last week, New Mexico experienced wildfires, heavy rain, mudslides, a haboob dust storm, and severe flooding, all within a couple of days. As we were just discussing, some communities like those in Iowa and Texas have been hit multiple times by disasters. But we're also seeing communities this year that are experiencing a disaster for the first time. How might the seasons or geography for particular weather hazards be changing from our traditional definition or understandings?
Thank you for the question. Climate change is shifting the frequency of some of these extreme weather hazards at any given location. So for instance, there are parts of Iowa where flooding is becoming more likely and more common in a changing climate. There are other places where it becomes less likely as our world warms. And on top of that, climate change can exacerbate the compounding hazards. For instance, as we're warming, we're heating some areas that are maybe naturally a little on the dry side anyway. They become drier. Those areas are in drought more often, and they become more prone to wildfire as the vegetation dries out. So these are not separate hazards, they're connected. Similarly, when we have areas of shifting storm patterns where we get more storminess, perhaps in the spring and early summer, that brings the threats of what you consider to be your, severe thunderstorm hazards, hail, wind, tornadoes, and also can bring the increased threat of both flash flooding and long-lasting river flooding. So when you compound these hazards, especially, that puts our vulnerable and underprepared communities, our underserved communities, at risk. It's hard to cope with a hazard if a community is not used to it happening because they don't have the past experience or perhaps the resources and equipment to cope with it. Or when the frequency changes, if it's something that used to happen perhaps maybe once every few years, and then it starts to happen once a generation, you lose that generational knowledge of how to cope with this. The flip is also true. If something used to happen very rarely and then becomes increasingly common, it also becomes harder to cope with it as you have to continually deplete those resources. Within NOAA, we want our nation to be a climate ready nation, one that is ready in our communities to build resilience to the hazards of climate change and extreme weather, ready to mitigate the risks associated with these hazards and adapt to the future in the ways that will serve our communities best, but particularly our vulnerable communities.
Thank you for that. Let me stay with you. You've done some research on rural weather patterns. What are the impacts we should be aware of?
We have a range of impacts across the country related to our changing climate, but in general, in the United States, the farther north and east you go, the more we're seeing a wetting trend, and the farther south and west you go, the more we're seeing a drying trend. There's an area in the middle where it isn't that we're staying the same necessarily, or maybe our average precipitation through a whole year might be close to the same. But what we are getting is less frequent of rainfall, so longer dry periods. But when the rain falls, it falls heavier. So we get more of that flooding and flash flooding, less restorative moisture into the ground in that swing between the extremes. All of these changes can be hard to cope with, especially when our infrastructure and the plants we grow and our lifestyles have been built around the climate that we had a century ago and not built yet for the climate that is here now or coming in the future. There are some storm patterns that are shifting. This is still an area of emerging research. The research about how, for instance, tornadoes or hailstorms are changing in a changing climate is still very new. We still have a lot of work to do in these areas, but some of the research that is emerging shows those patterns changing. So, for instance, the time of year when we get storms is shifting to a little earlier, more in the, say, spring to early summer, where in the midsummer to late summer, it's too warm for these storms to develop. And we can't quite get that moisture that we actually need from these storms at a time when we are used to having it to grow crops, for instance, or alleviate heat. So, there's an interconnection between what's happening to the temperatures and the warming side, but so much more than that with the effects that that change has on extreme weather. And just a small shift in the average temperature of a globe, which doesn't sound like very much, becomes a big shift in the chance of these extremes as we shift those patterns and shift how frequently something happens.
Thank you. Thank you for sharing how science is tracking and responding to these changes. Still a lot of evolution there that you and the academic community is still grappling with. Thomasina, many of the disasters this year are in rural communities and communities with high levels of poverty and few resources. What are the logistical challenges of getting services to them? And are you seeing the same level of support as Houston gets when it is affected by a disaster?
Some of the logistical challenges is in those particular communities. One, they're not usually the first place that resources go to. They don't usually have the support of large organizations or large entities to be able to identify someone in that community to connect with to be able to get resources to them. So that usually poses as the first problem. Um, and so one of the things that we do at Houston Response is we build coalitions of churches in each community with churches, community leaders, school leaders, organizational leaders. So that way, when there is a disaster or crisis that happen, there are points of contact and different relationships amongst those within the coalition that they can connect to be able to get resources there to help the families there that are in need. Another part of it is that oftentimes when resources do come in, they're centralized to a certain location, but then some of the families don't have the capacity to get to the resources. They may not have transportation, or the resources that are available doesn't necessarily match to their immediate need, or it's for example, if they're out of power, but yet they are getting food that could be cooked. Well, they can't necessarily cook food. They can't necessarily store food. So they need more hot meals versus non-perishable meals. So, and it's difficult to, for them to be able to send in resources that actually, that the families could actually use or be able to get to. Another aspect of that is that oftentimes, in those areas, they're very widespread across a big community. And so when groups come in, they're wanting to be able to sit and serve thousands at one location, but it usually needs to span over 5, 10, maybe even 15 miles across the community. And so at that point, then that's usually not a place to go to. I mean, during the derecho storm, we had groups that came in from other parts of the country, and they were centralized in one part of the city that had a large population, but yet there was a community that was maybe 25 miles away that no one was servicing. There were no resources there. They were a community that was in an unincorporated part. They had small churches that the families were going to, but those churches and organizations didn't have national relationships. They didn't have contacts with elected officials And so no one necessarily knew what the real need was, or there were thousands of people over there that were suffering without power and without food and without transportation to get to that. And so one of the things we were able to connect with them is letting them know, hey, there's a whole group over a whole communities over here that don't have anything. And so those partners were able to share with them. And I'll say one other thing. One of the caveats to that was when that partner came into town, they had semi truckloads full of resources to help, but then those particular partners didn't have the infrastructure of their building to offload a semi truck. They didn't have forklifts. They didn't have pallet jacks. They may have had lonely church volunteers or community volunteers to come, but they didn't necessarily have the physical or the equipment to offload. So then that became a challenge because they say, hey, we can get supplies there, but they have to be in a position that has a loading dock or have a pallet jack that can offload and have pallets and unpack. And so that posed a different problem where then we had to find a partner that could receive the supplies that were being donated that then can be distributed through another partner thing. So it's a so that delays the help that the families can get because of those different logistical things, because of the infrastructure or the capacity of the actual church that the families are going to, or the organizations the families are going to looking for help.
Thomasina, thank you so much for that rich response, really bringing out the very local community level conditions that are there, the need for coalitions to form, relationships to be established, pre-existing relationships to be established or built even, and then the challenges of infrastructure at a very kind of household community level, at the very micro level. So thank you for sharing those specific details in your particular context. Thank you. Amy, maybe back to you now. How can funders help people who are dealing with ongoing disasters?
Yeah, I love having conversations with community foundations. Actually, that's probably one of my deepest joys in this work because there are partners. They operate in a posture of partnership with the local community on a regular basis. And so the first thing that I would say is, if you as a funder, whether you're an institutional philanthropy or an individual, start with the question of who knows this community best. Because a lot of times, whether it's responding or giving, people want to help, and we get really attracted by this hero complex to be that check that does that thing. And that's not a bad thing, but I do think that if we take a minute and really seek to understand and be the most useful, in our experience, you'll be met with a welcome invitation into education and into understanding that has longevity. And then I really want to encourage the funding and support of activities beyond the basic needs, housing, food, things that are absolutely critical that we don't want to forget. But when we talk about a person or a community's resilience or ability to establish new rhythms and new cadences of wholeness and health, we need to consider memorial spaces, playgrounds, community events that allow for narrative coping, like art therapy, spaces that are unconventional. It may just happen outside of a school or inside a building that hasn't been used in a long time. Considering those components really do help a community as a whole have the freedom to invite all ages to enter into space of grief and of coping and stepping into a place of strength. So I would say those two things: seek to understand before you write the check, and be intentional about supporting things that may not fall into those immediate core needs.
Thank you, Amy. We're going to move to our question and answer portion after one final question to Carrie. Please make sure to put your questions in the Q&A box. So Carrie, when there are frequent disasters in a community, how can funders think about pre-staging their funds and ensuring they have funding for all phases of a disaster?
Well, we've been thinking a lot about this through our prep cohort, which is truly thinking about the community foundation's role, but we know that that's one piece of the puzzle, right? In any sort of preparedness effort, mitigation effort, or response or recovery effort. So people might think I paid Amy to say all those nice things about community foundations. It's certainly something that we have championed here. I mentioned our toolkit. One of the things we've encouraged all community foundations in Iowa and even community-based funds that may serve a specific community as opposed to a county or a region is to go ahead and establish their disaster recovery fund. It may be with $500, it may be with $50,000. They have come in all different shapes and sizes, but seeding that fund before a disaster happens has proven to be one of the most effective things to support both fundraising in the short term and long-term recovery for a community. We have also encouraged community foundations to do some of that coalition building work that Thomasina mentioned. And in our state, community foundations are often the hub that's bringing those partners together. So we have them building relationships with their local COADs and VOADs, EMS services, organizations that they can partner with to do that individual assistance work. All the players in that space, the front end partnership building is paying huge dividends on the back end. It doesn't always happen the way that we've outlined it in our toolkit, but we have learned that it does work if you can be thoughtful about that front end planning and having those funds established. So as soon as a disaster happens, you can start promoting that fund. That often is happening through social media and news media. And if that isn't happening at this point within 24 to 48 hours, we're now getting to that next disaster. And that's sometimes how you get forgotten or missed in that fundraising space. So, certainly some front end work that we've been encouraging community foundations to think about. A couple other things that I would highlight we've seen more recently here in Iowa are some creative and kind of looser strings type of funding that are being provided to communities. We have a private foundation in Council Bluffs called the Iowa West Foundation. They were impacted both in Council Bluffs and throughout Southwest Iowa with tornadoes in April. One thing they did in a proactive way was give a $10,000 grant to all of the volunteer fire departments in the communities that were impacted by those tornadoes. Super small amount of money for them. I realized 10,000 could be a lot for others. It was a small amount of money for them to be able to recognize the efforts of those departments and then help them think about the next disaster and get prepared for it, and also bringing them together around some of the things that they learned together. The other thing that they did was offered a match opportunity. So if the community foundation in Pottawatomie County, which is where Council Bluffs is located, raised $50,000, they'd match that dollar for dollar. That really helped encourage that local Iowan to Iowan giving and help people get involved in their own community's recovery. So that was another thing that I think could be replicated and modeled, especially by private funders who maybe don't have as many restrictions as some other funders do. We also know that corporate foundation match is another good strategy, and also corporate foundations just partnering with those community foundations, getting those resources directly to those funds, and then leading with a trust-based philanthropy mindset that those local community leaders know how best to use those resources. I think that's kind of underscoring some of what Amy was sharing about, like learning about the community is also just trusting those community foundation and coalition leaders. The final thing I'll say is we also have seen some kind of longer term learnings of disaster response and recovery efforts. I'll mention the community of Marshalltown. They have had numerous severe weather events, including a significant tornado, and then the year following were impacted by the derecho in Iowa. And so thinking about the slide of the layering disasters and throw in a pandemic in there, they have definitely been a community where we've seen kind of ebbs and flows of needing to restart that recovery process. But what their community foundation and a private foundation there did was they decided to align all of their grant making for the last several years around the community's broader city plan and recovery efforts. So they weren't doing kind of one-off projects to support the community, but it was an aligned and a coordinated effort between city and county leaders and private philanthropy. And I think that's, again, something from kind of a playbook that people could plug into their communities and really easily align some of their efforts with things that are already underway.
Thank you, Carrie. Great examples around readiness and very specific examples too about what you're seeing other donors provide in terms of assistance to really bridge this gap that's there, especially in the context of continuing disasters and how we can move to different phases of funding. Thank you. We've received several questions in advance. I'll be working through that list and any we receive in the Q&A box. As a reminder, CDP webinars aim to provide education for the philanthropic community. So while all are welcome to pose a question, we will first focus on those addressing funder issues. Maybe I'll continue with you, Carrie, first. Are funders generally open to urgent proposals during times of emergency outside of standard submission deadlines? It's a very particular question, but I think useful for our audience.
Yeah, I definitely think we have seen that. We did a very brief survey and report on that actually during the pandemic to see which processes folks had changed, which policies people had changed. And then one of our final questions in that survey was, and how many of these things will stick for the long term? We saw funders being really nimble. We saw funders adapting and being flexible in how they were awarding funds. But we were really concerned that the pendulum would kind of swing the full way back to some of the traditional grant making practice. I am happy to report that a lot of funders have continued with less restrictive grants and more easy to access process. We have funders that are now taking one paragraph or one page applications, receiving reports that they have already shared with other funders for other grants, not having to do kind of a customized report if a report is even necessary at all for a disaster grant. We also have a lot of that front end relationship building happening. So those are kind of really transactional awards that are happening because the relationship and the trust has already been built. So if a disaster happens, the money flows. That's really kind of the ultimate goal, is to have those caring and trusted relationships to get the dollars out as swiftly as possible. We're not all there yet. I can't say that for all funders in Iowa, but we have seen some bright spots and would certainly encourage those on the webinar today to think about the places where they can loosen those strings. And of course, general operating support is the most important type of funding for any nonprofit partner, but I think that cannot be overstated when it comes to disaster response as well.
Thank you. Really great recommendations. Thank you for that. Perhaps for Barb, what are the projected trends in the number and severity of these types of storms that we've been seeing over the past few months in the coming years?
Again, some of the research on this is still in the baby phase or in the toddler phase. We're still growing with it, but so many different kinds of disasters. This could be a whole webinar by itself, going through each of these. For instance, hurricanes. Let's talk about hurricanes a moment for those who live along the coasts. They are, of course, a threat in any given year. But as our oceans warm, warmer ocean gives more fuel to hurricanes and can fuel their intensity. We're not really clear about whether it changes the number of hurricanes very much, but it does make that potential intensity higher, and the potential for rapid intensification right before landfall gets higher too. So that brings, hurricanes are bad enough as it is, right? But rapid intensification right before they make landfall means they're a little harder to predict. It also means that potential for even more rainfall out of a tropical storm or hurricane. They are copious rainfall producers as it is, and just adding even more moisture to that system can create all kinds of hazards both along the coasts and inland as hurricane remnants track up and across the United States. We've already talked a bit about severe thunderstorms and that the season of them may be changing. So might the location to some extent. We are always going to get tornadoes in what many people think of as the traditional tornado alley, Texas, Oklahoma, Kansas, Nebraska. But there are some studies now demonstrating that places more like in the Tennessee River Valley and the Ohio River Valley are seeing an increased frequency in tornadoes in those areas, or the storms that can produce tornadoes. So that is also an overlapping hazard because those locations have some particular vulnerabilities to severe thunderstorms and tornadoes, perhaps more so than the plains. And that includes the lack of visibility. Hills, mountains, trees make it really hard to see a storm coming. There's a higher percentage of the population living in manufactured or mobile homes, which again is a high point of vulnerability during storms. So there's some great research going on out there about those, not just where the location of tornadoes may or may not be shifting, but also perhaps just as, or more importantly, the overlapping vulnerability of the population that is becoming more affected by these storms. We are seeing floods in Iowa again. And after setting some records for flooding in 1880, in 1950, we're now seeing the floods of record come in 2011, 2019, 2024. This increase in flood frequency in some parts of the country is a problem that is going to continue again as warming puts more moisture in the atmosphere and lets that come down in the form of heavy rains that happen a lot all at once. There's still the randomness of weather involved, right? Any given storm can pop up anywhere. You can set up a day or two of thunderstorms that track in the same places right along rivers and put a bunch of water in the system that's going to flood as it drains out, which is essentially what happened here. But underneath all of these different storms comes that little boost of extra moisture, perhaps extra energy or fuel in the atmosphere that tips these to being worse in a changing climate, that more moisture fueled, more flooding, right? It's the analogy that I have heard and used is that it's a little bit like a baseball player who uses steroids. You can't look at any one home run and say that home run happened because of the steroids, but you can look at the numbers over time and say they became more likely to hit home runs because of that steroid use. So here we are swinging the bat harder, more likely to be hitting a ball out of the park here with these storms, and more likely for these disasters to happen.
Wow, thank you. Very sobering in terms of the forecast. Yeah. Thomasina, you touched a little bit on one of your answers before, but maybe we can go a little bit further. How can an impacted community systematically and effectively coordinate the various sources of aid that become available?
So I would say in two ways. One is in preparation, preparedness, as well as collaboration. When we talk about preparedness and those vulnerable communities, a lot of it's really where building those partnerships within the community so those vulnerable populations can be more prepared. They're identified, and then even as an individual or individual families, they can be prepared for anything that's upcoming. One of the things that a lot of the things that have happened in Houston area is that as it relates to severe weather, it's the storms, the damage from the storms that we've had. We've had high heat. Last summer we had 51 days of over 100 temperature. And so that was very detrimental to those vulnerable populations because a lot of them didn't have central air and heat in their home. I mean, central air conditioning in their homes. So then that posed a problem. And so we, had to build cooling centers for them. In the wintertime, we have hard freezes that sporadically come. And so, and then you have your storms that pass. And so year round is something different that relates to weather. And so with preparation, it's knowing that in those seasons that these are the things that could happen. These are the vulnerable communities, and this is going to be the need. So what we were doing last year when we knew we were facing the high heat, we have a lot of different church partners and nonprofit partners that have gift in kind programs. And so we were encouraging them to store their heaters, the little space heaters, because we knew there was a large population of senior citizens. There were populations in the community that was not going to have heat in their homes. And we knew there were going to be a hard freeze coming because our partnership with the Office of Emergency Management and all our VOAD partners was saying, hey, we need to be preparing for the winter because it's high heat now. We need to prepare for hard freezes. And so when we did have a hard freeze, we were able to help get those heaters through those church partners and community partners to senior citizens and to those vulnerable populations to have heat in their homes. So then that way they wouldn't become displaced, they wouldn't cause any harm or injuries. And so, those of us thinking ahead of preparing for the things that we know are going to be of need. And then that moves into the collaboration part. One of the things that we know in our community is that we have to collaborate with one another. If not, those, especially those vulnerable populations, they even become more so overlooked and in danger situations happen to them. But when we collaborate and pull our resources together where the resources meet the needs, and the organizations that have the resources can partner with the organizations that are getting flooded with families of need, can partner together where those things can happen. And so in and out of severe weather seasons, we build collaboration conversations. So then that way we can prepare for each thing. And that's systematically that has helped us be able to minimize chaos. I mean, when any type of severe weather, you never know what the output is going to be. But one of the things that we've learned over the years is that if we can prepare our community and if we can collaborate our resources with one another, it helps maximize the impact that we're able to make. There's one thing we've been talking about this year and sharing the statistic. One of our universities does a social survey every year. And one of the things they shared was that 60% of the people in our city do not have $400 of emergency funds they have access to. So if we think about a severe weather case that happens, a lot of times you need funds on hand to help yourself to get to sustain yourself until you come out of that. And so if we have 60% that do not have access to $400, so that preparation aspect of it is how do we help you prepare to get to a point where you have financial emergency funds that can help you? How do we help you prepare for the things that you can be aware? And then how do those organizations be able to collaborate with the knowledge and resources that they have to help their community prepare or be able to fulfill the gap for those families that would not be able to help themselves or be able to get out of an emergency situation based off of a severe weather storm?
Thank you. Quite complex in terms of all of the relationships, stakeholders, actors involved, but really appreciate the work that you and your organization are doing to help kind of make those connections there. I have a question for Amy now. What is your view, and happy to hear from other speakers too, but on investing in resilient responses to disasters, given the increasing frequency of disasters?
So I think that word resilient is what I think poverty eradication was about 10 years ago for the industry and nonprofits. So we have to be really intentional with what we say or what we mean, I should say, when we are saying resilience. And I start there because Vibrant and our disaster services team has been quite focused on helping our community define what that word means. We have an entire conference in October that is based on that theme, We the Resilient. So what I would say is, and what I've kind of been a student of over the last 5 years, is resilient responses start with the staff of organizations that are responding to the community needs. We have seen a level of burnout and exhaustion in these small and medium sized and even large sized organizations that have been just perpetually called into a place of care. And for many of you, you hear the words self-care and you can feel the eyeballs rolling out of people's heads because what do you mean? I don't have time to take care of myself. I have to focus on what I need to do. This is the urgency and the real, we're talking about people not having funds to cover emergencies on a very human level. Like, how can I not pour from an empty cup? That's the only option I have. But we have found that if we are intentional about partnering with, and it's a lot of what Vibrant does in some of our work in the disaster space, is partnering with nonprofits to create very specific spaces for their teams to know how to debrief, to know how to take breaks, to build a buddy system within their staff, to understand expectations when we shift from everyday operations to disaster time, although they may feel synonymous at times. Um, we have to invest in the teams that are caring for our communities first. And it's hard to do because it isn't sexy and it doesn't come with a bunch of quantitative results to bigger funders. But if you look at the research and the evidence-based information that's out there about using a trauma-informed approach to caring for your team, you watch profitability and effectiveness increase significantly, statistically significantly across the organization. So um, invest in that, absolutely. Please do, is what I would say to that question. But really scrutinize your own opinion about what's worth it. Because I think one of the most challenging things I hear from leaders and organizations is just, I can't get my funders around the idea that my team need time off. They need a retreat. They need a schedule or resources that are available and encouraged for them to use as a part of their regular everyday. It's not just in disaster time, but it is especially necessary. And the last thing I'll say is that modeling that sense of self-care or workforce protection or mission alignment, whatever, however you want to frame it, modeling that as a leader is the key to creating a culture and really taking a look at the systems that you have in place that could limit your organization's ability to create a sense of freedom around whole health and resilience. I'll stop there.
Thank you. Appreciate you calling out how important it is to look after our own mental health and well-being as we support others. So thank you for that, Amy. Barb, I know we only have a couple of minutes left, but one particular question that came in from our live Q&A, what are the implications to agriculture and the food system with the changing climate? It's a big question, but maybe you can answer in a couple of minutes.
Again, could be a whole webinar just on
There
this.
you go.
But,
And then some.
I mean, there are serious implications for what can be grown now and in the future as the climate changes. For instance, as our arid regions, say the high plains, the western parts of our current areas where we can grow crops, as those continue to dry, even irrigated crops are going to struggle at some point. We also, have to worry about things like future depletion of the Ogallala Reservoir that waters a lot of those crops. So on the other side sort of the precipitation spectrum, agriculture in the Midwest faces concerns in the spring with wet springs and how difficult that can make it for planting some of the crops, or early spring flooding that can take what was planted and disrupt it and cause a need for fresh planting. So it changes a bit of the seasonality of when things can go in the ground. Plus, there's the risk of what happens when the crops are already in the ground and growing, the storms that can come. This tendency that we're seeing toward hotter and drier midsummers is also a problem, because even corn, which thrives in heat, still needs the moisture that goes along with it. And this trend toward hotter, drier, and to some extent less stormy mid to late summer can take that corn crop or the soybean crop and disrupt its ability to grow. And I see Carrie nodding your head. You live in Iowa, you know this too. And that's just focusing on sort of the big scale row crop type agriculture. Horticulture and vegetable growing is also getting disrupted in different ways as our freeze cycles change. For instance, the late winter gets warmer, but we still have freezes that come in the late winter. So buds emerge, trees start to come out of hibernation, and they get nipped by these freezes that aren't necessarily even late. They're kind of on time, but so much growth could happen because it was so warm already that it causes damage. And a big example of this occurred in 2012. We had a very warm spring, and a lot of things emerged in February and March that would normally not emerge until April and May. And a freeze came in April, not that late, but it disrupted, I think, 90 to 95% of the cherry crop in Michigan, and peach trees across the Midwest, and a whole bunch of other horticulture type growth, the tree-based type growth, right? Where you can't just plant it later and wait it out. So again, this could be a whole webinar, but the long story short is everything about what we currently have adapted to in our ability to grow things to eat is going to change as the climate changes. It isn't just enough to say, well, the growing season is going to be longer because we're warming. It doesn't really help if we're not getting the precipitation when we need it and in the amounts and the form that we need it. And it doesn't really help if we increase the vulnerability at the beginning and end of that season too. So it seems like it would be maybe one of those areas where it's not so bad, but there's still a lot that can happen to those crops that's detrimental in a changing climate.
Thank you so much, Barb. Yes, could spend hours talking about this, and also so many other rich questions that we have that came in prior to the webinar and in our Q&A that we just can't get to. So really appreciate everybody's thoughtful questions that you wanted to ask our panel. And we just have a few minutes left, so I will wrap up now. So to wrap up with some thoughts as to what funders could do to help alleviate the impact of all the severe weather we've been experiencing and what is yet to come. So network beyond your usual partners. We heard stories about that today also, and being creative. Unusual circumstances call for unusual responses. As funders, we can bring together a diverse group, including faith and community leaders, politicians and government staff, chambers of commerce and business people, non-governmental organizations, academics, others. Use your resources to convene discussions and position grassroots leaders and organizations as equal partners. Strengthen the capacity of communities, both hard infrastructure and organizations. Funders with large amounts of money to invest in disasters could look at how they can support communities to strengthen their physical infrastructure. While most mitigation projects will need government support, funders could pay for a planning study, bring community members to discuss solutions, or ensure that smaller or rural governments have the cost share components of development covered. And finally, recognize the need for increased investments. When COVID first hit in 2020, and again later with the racial reckoning following the murder of George Floyd, we saw funders going beyond their usual donations to support new and increased needs. This is needed again. As disasters intensify and grow in frequency, more funders are going to have to step up to support all phases of a disaster. No matter your area of funding, all funders are disaster funders. Don't hesitate to reach out to CDP to help you develop a disaster strategy if it's a new area for you. CDP offers a range of expert resources to help you in planning disaster grant making. We have a monthly newsletter full of information and regular blogs, including our What We're Watching blog that highlights disasters worldwide. CDP staff are always available to provide guidance, and if you need more in-depth assistance, we also provide various consulting services. You can find more information about our work at disasterphilanthropy.org. And for our next webinar next month on July 11th at 1 p.m. Eastern, join us for a special conversation between Tiffany Benjamin, president of the Humana Foundation and CDP's board chair, and Dr. Ilan Kelman, author of Disaster by Choice, as they discuss why we should be all removing the word natural from the phrase natural disasters. And to respect everyone's time, we're right at 2 o'clock on the East Coast, and keep this to an hour, unfortunately. That is all the time we have today for today's webinar. Thank you again to the Council of Foundations, Giving Compass, and United Philanthropy Forum for co-sponsoring this webinar, and to our panelists, Carrie, Thomasina, Amy, and Barb, for taking the time to share their insights with us. Thank you all. Please take a moment to complete our post-webinar survey to let us know what you liked and what you would like to see in future webinars. It will pop up automatically when you exit the webinar. If you have questions or thoughts that were not addressed during today's webinar, you may email them to tanya.miller, gulliver-garcia@disasterphilanthropy.org. And thank you again, and have a great afternoon.